Welcome to Get Wisdom Live with Carl Mollison and Brian Kelly. What if God was also a co-host? What if the historically rare ability to question God directly and get profound answers back has been rediscovered? What would God say to today's sophisticated but deeply troubled world? Get Wisdom Live is here to share those answers with you. Here is Carl Mollison and Brian Kelly. Welcome to another episode of Get Wisdom Live. I'm Brian Kelly, along with Get Wisdom founder and director, Carl Mollison. This week, Creator teaches about suffering and its healing. You know, I consider this kind of a statement show, Carl. Been kind of exploring this idea of if suffering has any value, especially in the eyes of the divine, beyond where it's something you just want to get past and get beyond, heal it, get away from it, or does it actually have some value, especially in the calculus of determining holiness, for instance? Is it a path to holiness is probably the big question. So we're giving Creator a platform here to, I think, weigh in a very emphatic way on this question, Carl.
Well, this is something that comes up again and again because our world is problematical and there are many who suffer. And it can become a lifestyle and a preoccupation that is an exaggeration or a kind of default mode that has a sense of sameness and thus safety. And people can just get stuck becoming helpless because then it's hard to become fully functional again. It takes work once you've gone into a decline. And so there's a lot of dimensions to this. And when it becomes a kind of pursuit as a religious notion, it actually has some danger to the progress of the person. And that's what we're going to bring out, I think.
I agree. You asked Creator, there is a pervasive idea that suffering is a kind of currency, that suffering has value, that it has a price that can be exchanged for actual tangible items of value. We see this play out in courtrooms all over the world every day, where someone is awarded a monetary equivalent for pain and suffering. Where there is a direct linkage between a perpetrator and a victim, this makes some sense. Suffering is also imposed on perpetrators in a misguided effort to even the score, as in prison sentences. Again, the idea is that suffering has compensatory value. Does suffering have any value in the eyes of the divine? Is there a suffering scorekeeper out there? Can we purchase redemption, enlightenment, or favor exclusively via raw suffering without any requisite growth in wisdom? What can Creator tell us?
All right, this is what I've channeled from Creator of all that is. These are Creator's words. It is certainly the case that suffering entails a cost, and often a quite significant and severe one. This could be loss of time, loss of productivity and advancement in life, loss of status, privilege, economic security, even personal freedom. And then there is freedom from pain, physical pain, emotional pain, and anguish, on and on, the many slings and arrows of life. The things done to a person by themselves and others create innumerable circumstances and opportunities for mischief, if not mayhem, all of which take a toll. So to say they are simply an idea, a concept, something divorced from physical consequences altogether, is unworkable from the human perspective because you are enmeshed in the physical plane, awash in negative energies of all kinds and quite vulnerable to a worsening of things. And should that happen, you will pay dearly with suffering. To avoid that often takes means that could well be costly: to hire bodyguards, to live in a better part of town, to build fences around one's homestead to keep out evildoers, and so on. Not to mention the costs of getting specialized care if one is injured or impaired, or requiring prolonged hospitalization and then rehabilitation to recover from grievous harm done by a perpetrator. So the list is endless of things that can go wrong for varied reasons. And the reality is, there will be something carved out of your life if you suffer. it will be a lost opportunity to do something better. If nothing else, this is undeniable and can be measured quite precisely in terms of energy, both of a positive or negative nature. This, the law of karma, the law of cause and effect, does with exquisite precision. It is the toll keeper, so to speak, noting when something is subtracted from your life or someone else's at your doing or participation, perhaps with others in a kind of group assault of some kind. This could be people planning takeover of a company, outing their boss to get them fired for selfish reasons, simply because of some dislike or disapproval of their politics or perceived unworthiness to be in a position of greater power and control. The many things that tempt people to cross the line into wrongdoing will count against them energetically. This, the law of karma, notes with great accuracy. So, the inclination of humans to want compensation for harm done and to equate wrongdoing with a kind of needed sacrifice and restitution on the part of the perpetrator, if only to serve time in jail as a substitute for the suffering they caused others, is an attempt, at least, to balance the books. This is all based on ignorance. Not knowing the law of karma is always operating and will take care of it. So, in the absence of understanding this precise clockwork mechanism for restoring and rebalancing energetic disarray, they will seek a more down to earth retribution. This sometimes is overdone, misapplied, and all too crude an instrument to truly match the deficit in question and effect a restoration that bridges with it greater understanding, that brings with it greater understanding and wisdom by the parties involved. That is an essential component of true and complete healing. So, the divine perspective is the application of a mechanism to effect a rebalancing energetically, but with the learning of a life lesson from the experience. So all involved will be smarter and wiser and more likely to do better in the future to avoid temptation to exploit others on the part of a perpetrator and to be stronger, more resilient, better prepared, and more effective in countering opposition so as to avoid being taken advantage of and leaving oneself vulnerable through ignorance or neglect.
So, as usually is the case with answers from Creator in this project, Carl, the answer is more complicated than we maybe expect or anticipate, at least the common person anyway. In this case, there is a divine scorekeeper. It's a mechanism, though. It's not. It's an automatic mechanism of great precision called karma, and left alone, it's going to execute precisely and without passion, right? I mean, it's the karma is not sitting there with a big smile on its face and practicing sadism. It's delivering precisely what was delivered by the perpetrator, you know. Or at the same time, if you do something good, you reap the rewards in an equally dispassionate fashion. So the idea that suffering has value means, does suffering make God happy, right? I mean, that's really the end of the day. And the answer we're hearing is no, definitely not.
Yeah, and I think this entire answer is conveying a message that we need to rise above suffering. In other words, there's work to do. When you're suffering, there's work to do. There's things that need to happen, things to be done, things to be acquired that aren't in place yet. So it's not a dead end. And that's a kind of self sentencing if you get to that state. So what this is pointing to is there's always a path to something better. And this is the divine wisdom in delivering hope for us when we're in our darkest times.
Indeed. You ask Creator, the idea that raw suffering has value is showcased most emphatically in the crucifixion and death of Jesus Christ. It is a foundational notion in Christianity that Jesus died for our sins, quote unquote. That his suffering and death to that his suffering and death purchased God's forgiveness for sinners, and that it was a necessary ransom to assuage the otherwise justice demanding or perhaps even suffering demanding God. If there's any truth to any of this, then it does indeed suggest that God values suffering in its own right, that there is a divine economy of suffering with its own exchange rate, amortization, storage facilities, and even loans and credit. What is Creator's perspective?
And Creator says, Creator does not value or desire suffering, but recognizing that suffering will happen to beings in the physical plane, that is inherent in the nature of existence when your makeup is of a physical nature and vulnerable to many kinds of injury. There are reasons for the existence of living creatures in the physical, and this is primarily to experience the possibility and consequences of negativity under circumstances where you have an attenuation of personal power, so that in response to an affront, you will be somewhat limited in how you might respond to fight back. You will be able to do relatively less damage to others as a physical being than as a light being under similar circumstances if you were set upon and harmed grievously. The purpose of the enterprise you are a part of is to learn by working through and experiencing how to handle adversity and regain your balance so things do not get out of control and overstep boundaries to become a source of grievous harm that will leave lasting damage, both to the perpetrator and victim alike. There is great learning in taking on such a challenging existence. All of you have your innings and take turns being in harm's way as a means to learn about it and experience the consequences firsthand personally. This is because the greatest learning is from life experience, not in a classroom or from reading a learned work describing things like the meaning of life, the operating rules and procedures, and recommended policies for making one's way productively and successfully. One can learn a good deal from what others have experienced, in a sense, blazing a trail before you. But it is human nature to learn best when the lesson is accompanied by emotion, and the greater the emotion, the more profound the lesson. There is greater joy in helping to build a castle for one's dwelling than to read about castles in a book and only fantasize about what it might be like to have such a residence and lifestyle. Acquiring the needed means to have creature comforts, financial security, beautiful surroundings, and amiable companionship covers most of the bases of a joyous life in the physical. But that idyllic circumstance, filled with positive attributes, is the minority of lives that are lived. Most people experience shortcomings and sometimes quite profound ones. This makes it difficult to progress because it leads to struggling and suffering, which bogs the person down and may keep them stuck for a lifetime if the challenges are simply overwhelming. This incurs a great cost to the soul, and the karmic consequences will be substantial as well. Coming back into a new incarnation following such a lifetime will often see the person repeating the experience and perhaps starting earlier with the goal of prompting them to find a solution in time to save themselves from suffering. If they fail, that increases the buildup of negativity, and this will be projected into the future and become an ever greater obstacle to overcome. So life gets harder and not easier. That reality is the downside of life experience. Living through a challenge and triumphing is the greatest of possible teachers because it will reward you for finding an effective path and going the distance, doing enough of the right things to come out on top. The rewards will be tremendous for the successful in gaining much hard won wisdom and knowledge in the bargain. But for those who falter, who make a misstep and get lost by the wayside, lacking the means to help themselves effectively, will find their journey in a new lifetime all the harder and will have to work extra hard to avoid a repeat failure. You are seeing in this description how karma, in effect, metes out a kind of justice, more finely attuned in matching levels of responsibility for the creation of negativity, to provide feedback as a life lesson that requires a kind of repayment. And many times, the form of that repayment might turn out to be going through a life as someone's victim if one has been a perpetrator in previous lifetimes. That is one way to rebalance negative karma when created. And here again, you see by this description how the law of karma can do a much more precise, accurate, and effective leveling of the playing field to effect a kind of restitution by wrongdoing people, so they must give back in some way or another an equivalent energy. And that act of reconstitution might be a quite painful one. It might be a rich person ends up losing their fortune, and that would be a just and fitting experience to go through for someone who deprived others in a prior life of financial abundance, causing them to live in poverty and perhaps even die young through a lack of means to have necessary things for survival. The purpose of existence is to learn how to live in divine alignment while facing adversity that might challenge you again and again. But we can tell you that victory will bring you the greatest of rewards from taking on this challenge. So, in that perspective, your suffering becomes a kind of currency, giving you something of great value in learning discernment and wisdom. But this is a benefit that can only be experienced under the right conditions and will not be achieved through arbitrary secondary punishments for wrongdoing, as done with the human legal system or vigilantism by individuals wanting revenge.
So this is another complex answer, essentially. Um, Creator is basically saying that suffering has value, but only in so much as it contributes to discernment and wisdom. I think the goal here, Creator talks about adversity, and a lot of people have this idea that adversity is equivalent to suffering. But I think what Creator is saying here is that really the goal of physical existence is to learn how to navigate adversity without personal suffering, to be wise, to be strong, to be brave, to be calm, to be strong. I mean, that's really what this is all about at the end of the day, I think, Carl.
Well, I've heard a number of spiritual people or would be spiritual people pointing out that suffering is a choice. And that's often, I think, misunderstood as blaming the victim, blaming the one who
Right.
suffers. Oh, suck it up, get a grip on yourself and, shape up. And it isn't so easy. We do need compassion and understanding when people are going through maybe the worst times in their life and maybe the worst times ever. At least it feels that way in the moment. And so this is a personal journey and a personal struggle. So it's hard when you're suffering to have this kind of perspective, to know there's something better out there and know how to go and get it. So that's what we try to do here at Get Wisdom, to bring some understanding of how this all works, so people get the idea there is a living God, there is a path to God, and getting back in divine alignment requires healing. So the spirituality is the path to deliverance in all respects and all levels.
Yeah. Well, I think an important acquisition is proper perspective, wise perspective, divine perspective. And perhaps if suffering has any value, it is in helping you acquire that kind of divine perspective. But that's extraordinarily hard to do. I mean, that's really what the pinnacle of achievement is, I think, in terms of a human being. So, we have to get through our day to day life in the meantime, and that's why healing is so important. Because too much suffering can bog us down. It's going to take a long time to get the perspective needed. It's not something that can be done overnight. So, your idea that suffering really needs to be addressed in a healing approach to keep people moving along the path, I think is critical.
Yeah,
U.S. creator, yeah,
it's
go ahead.
not easy. I'm just saying it's not easy and
Oh,
does
it's
take
definitely
time.
not easy. Definitely not easy. And we need to keep that in perspective as well, so that there has to be, that's a lesson of patience, right? Is understanding that overcoming suffering is not easy, and that we have to be patient with ourselves and with others because it's going to take time, multiple lifetimes, in fact. So it's not something you just snap your fingers and resolve in an instant. U.S. creator, many people have reported seeing Jesus in near-death experiences, and he is often the first contact personality that they encounter. This has happened to many folks who, while knowing of Jesus, professed not to have any faith in his actual existence. The encounters are consistent in portraying him as overwhelmingly kind, loving, gentle, patient, and non judgmental. Often he will assume the role of coach and mentor and will try and help the departing soul figure out who they are, where they are, and what options they have, such as returning or staying. When did Jesus assume this role of greeting and coaching the dying? Was it immediately following his death and resurrection? Some have suggested that he exists in a voluntary form of limbo in order to take up the role of gatekeeper to heaven, and that taking up such residence in limbo required his traumatic death so that he himself could get stuck in limbo voluntarily. I want to emphasize the word voluntarily there. Something perhaps that would otherwise have been impossible given his normal vibrational levels. That this, in essence, is his sacrifice for our sake. Bottom line, is there any connection between his death and his current ongoing role of heavenly gatekeeper? What can Creator tell us?
All right, Creator says, here again is the human distortion in seeing suffering as currency that has a certain sacred place in things, and thus is something to be emulated, sought for, and even indulged in by misguided attempts to be more worthy. We would say that this scenario, the meaning of Christ's experiences, is being turned on its head. It was not his death that led him to being an ambassador for the light, to greet ascending souls, but his life. The fact that he was exalted, revered, and worshiped by all who knew him, and the fact that he was a symbol of divinity through his very makeup and existence, and how he conducted his life as the life of enlightenment for many, many others, bringing divine wisdom to the masses, and many personal healings as a demonstration that suffering is not inevitable, but can be countered through divine grace. This is as powerful a demonstration of love as one could want. The experience of a blind man having his vision restored after years of deprivation is a blessing impossible to appreciate fully by the sighted. But those miracles illustrate a fundamental truth that is of great significance for everyone. Your suffering has meaning too, it has a purpose too, and it can be the gateway to your expansion and growth in better understanding what is at stake, the reason you are alive to begin with, and represent a challenge as well as valuable feedback in how you are dealing with life and making your way. Is your journey one of growth and learning, bringing joy your way? Or is it an uphill battle, or even a downward spiral of increasing despair, dishevelment, and degradation? Christ's suffering was the price he paid for becoming human himself. It was not a consequence of the inhumanity of others, except for the interlopers and their influence on society. That continues today. And in a sense, all are living a life like Christ did under difficult circumstances. Many people's lives are shortened from similar circumstances where they stood out in some way and were cut down in their prime by jealous and depraved overseers wanting to crush the human spirit and meting out punishments of all kinds to sideline people, diminish their happiness, and sometimes end their lives. What Christ is doing to greet those returning to the light is simply a continuation of that life, not the suffering he endured with his ending in the physical, but the inspiration he brought to humanity that lives on, the joy in the idea of Jesus Christ and what he stood for as an example to others, and a promise of the divine that God is real, God is just, and God is loving. All were important truths, and Christ is living his truth in choosing to be there for those in need to overcome their last hurdle of physical existence to make it back to heaven safe and sound. It is a reality for him that so many believe in him and thus need his help because they call out his name again and again, pray to him, and have devoted themselves to him, and thus turn to him in their hour of need. So that mission life created a great responsibility he continues to meet in being available to the true believers. And he does minister to all in need, not just the Christians who know about his life and have adopted the human created churches honoring his mission and contributions.
There are so many things revealed, I think, in this answer that we could easily spend the rest of the show talking about just this one channeling. I think there's a lot of hints, a lot of things, a lot of threads that we can follow to get further insight. But it seems that the life of Christ has far more richness and meaning than even we understand at this point. And I think there's more to explore here, Carl.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we will in a future episode, I promise you. You ask, Creator, how long does Jesus intend to fulfill this role of heavenly gatekeeper? Will this role become unnecessary following the ascension? Who else serves as gatekeepers for those who are unfamiliar with Jesus at all? What can Creator tell us?
All right. And Creator says Jesus Christ will continue to serve as long as he is needed. His service will continue even following the ascension. And you will be like him, survivors of the human experience and the great learners and healers who have been tested by fire and were tempered by that flame to grow strong and true and become ever stronger with a depth and richness of character obtainable in no other way. You will all be ambassadors of light throughout the universe. So your missions will continue in new ways, in new planes of existence. It will be a source of tremendous joy and satisfaction because never again will you need to face the level of negativity of the physical plane. You will continue helping those still working through their karmic issues, the extraterrestrial races who have acted as predators, and you came to heal. They will still need your healing contributions, but you will never again be at their mercy. You will graduate from that rough duty and risk of karmic injury personally. Many others in the light serve alongside Christ as ambassadors, as light callers to greet those ascending. Many times it is light beings who predeceased the one in transition. So someone they recognize coming for them can literally raise their spirit and enable them energetically to increase their vibration and make a successful ascension to the light. Many of you take turns doing such duty and may be called on for members of your soul group who you know in your current life. And you will repay the gift given to you in your many incarnations and return to the higher astral plane. This is not a penalty tour, but an opportunity for earning the blessings of positive karma from such wonderful gifts of loving kindness. That is always the way to view helping others. It will help you in the doing.
You know, Jesus appearing to those who have departed is something we've learned about from those who've had near death experiences. Now, the key thing about a near death experience is that they come back, right? Well, except for the channeling series that you're doing with light beings, nobody's ever come back from heaven to tell us, what's going on or even how they were greeted, right? So the ones that tell us how they were greeted are the ones that came back to life. So it seems that Christ is definitely playing a role for those in terms of, whether they have a decision to make or not, or even being coached about, hey, you're going back, but this is what's going to happen. So I'm thinking that if you die and there's no possibility of you coming back, in those situations, you may be greeted by family, people that you've known before, because the decision's already made, right? You don't need a coach to help you work through something of great importance for your life. Whereas if you're dying and you're essentially in limbo at heaven's gate, Jesus is going to take up the role of mentor if there's a choice that you have to make in that moment. And you might think that maybe that's the role of your higher self, but none of us have a physical image of our higher self in mind, whereas Christ lived on the earth and had a physical image and has that role of mentor. And so that maybe that's seen as a better substitute than a light that's your higher self and talking
Oh,
at you in a way that's unfamiliar. I don't know. It's speculation.
well, let me give a couple of anecdotes from personal experience, because another line of evidence is those like myself who do intuitive work and healing and work with the divine realm.
Hmm.
And one example is I have seen Jesus come to help people transition, because I work to help people transition with the Lightworker healing protocol, which we offer through Get Wisdom. And one of the early experiences I had starting out with this sort of endeavor was someone who had known a priest and truly loved the man came to me and said, I know he's struggling. I don't think he's made it back to heaven because he did things wrong in his life. And I think he's stuck. And this was true. I found that he was earthbound. This was a priest who had fallen in love with a parishioner, got her pregnant, and then aided and abetted her in getting an abortion. And when he reached the end of his life, he was so terrified of judgment and what he believed would send him to hell. He stayed earthbound. He wouldn't go back. The light callers came for him. He would not listen. He was hiding, virtually hiding.
Wow.
So I did my thing with the protocol to bring healing for him, to raise his vibration enough so that someone coming from the light could get through to him. And I witnessed that taking place. And guess who showed up? Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ came to the light to welcome and forgive this wayward priest. That's how people would think of this,
Right.
and help raise him up to go the distance and return to heaven.
And
So
who in that situation would have more credibility for a priest in particular than Jesus?
exactly, exactly. So this is like a hand in glove, a perfect answer. And one other quick example of a family member or loved one who predeceases serving that role. One of the things I did when I was starting out, since I didn't have many paying clients, I would work on people I knew about who had passed on to see if they were in need of services, if they were stuck. And so I'd look at famous celebrities, people, actors and actresses, and artists and musicians. And one day I checked on Marilyn Monroe and found she wasn't in the light. And this was like some, I don't know, 50 years after she had passed. She was still stuck.
Yeah.
And of course the story is she committed suicide. There's more to it, but she was troubled. She was a troubled person on her passing, and that's what gets people stuck in the earthbound plane. They're not at a high enough vibration to see the light callers and work with them. So I did a spirit rescue for her to help raise her up, and then I witnessed who came from the light. It was Joe DiMaggio, the baseball player she had had a marriage with and a great love for a time.
Mhm.
She had a series of relationships and so on. But this is just an anecdotal story. But we all have a Joe DiMaggio or
Yeah.
someone we revere who could step in and save the day for us when we need it most.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very important lessons indeed. You ask Creator. St. Faustina wrote in her diary that while in her convent's chapel, she heard this voice in my soul, quote unquote, saying, "There is more merit to 1 hour of meditation on my sorrowful passion than there is to a whole year of flagellation that draws blood. The contemplation of my painful wounds is of great profit to you, and it brings me great joy," quote unquote. Was that indeed Jesus or an Anunnaki psychic? If a soul like St. Faustina's or famous stigmatists like Padre Pio and St. Catherine of Siena take this kind of advice to heart and spend untold hours contemplating Christ's crucifixion, and especially if they were already gifted intuitives, might this explain how they acquired their stigmata? After all, Christ's passion is recorded in the Akashic records, and a truly gifted intuitive can likely experience that suffering directly if they choose to. Is there anything of profit to be gained from contemplating Christ's crucifixion in this manner?
All right. And Creator tells us the message St. Faustina received from Jesus in her prayer meditation was a genuine one, but was misunderstood by her perception of herself as being a supplicant and unworthy and in need of further suffering to, in her mind, make the grade, to measure up to what Christ endured, for example, as though this were a race to suffer, to see who could endure the most pain as a measure of their belief and holiness. Christ's message to her was to put aside thoughts of self punishment, as with flagellation, but to focus on the true meaning of his sacrifice, which was the giving of love to others, even in ways that put them at risk. Because it was often under such circumstances that love was most needed and most dangerous to engage in the eyes of those in power. So hers was a misinterpretation in seeing this seeming encouragement of seeking an intense identification with Christ's suffering as the be all and end all of attainment spiritually. Similarly, those highly sensitive individuals who came to venerate him saw his physical suffering as a mark of attainment through personal suffering and deprivation of a lofty status of holiness and worthiness in the eyes of God, almost to the point of suffering for suffering's sake. This is a kind of perversion of what the divine perspective is about, that it exalts suffering and the need to do so. We never see it as an end in itself, as a goal to be sought after and practiced, as with building one's tolerance to greater and greater self inflicted wounds, as a toughening up and a demonstration of devotion. We can tell you we see nothing exalted in mimicking the perversity of the perpetrator through acts of self torment. This is faulty thinking and will misdirect a person to misuse the power of their own consciousness. And this brings danger because your consciousness holds the power to harm yourself, much more so than you could ever harm another being. This is why self negativity and self directed neglect and abuse can be so devastating. One iconic demonstration of this capacity is the self creation of stigmata in the limbs of a true believer, wanting to emulate Christ's suffering as a kind of personal atonement and demonstration of holy attainment. This is the true source of such wounds. It is an example of mind over matter. It is not a divine creation because we will not harm a person even for a seemingly positive, if only self desired notion seen as an achievement to mimic Christ's wounds and suffering as a demonstration of devotion to his life and sacrifice. We see that as misguided to begin with. It was not the purpose of Christ's life and suffering to be an example for others to emulate the worst aspects, but rather to emulate the positive and loving things he did as a free man among the community, spreading love everywhere he went. His crucifixion is a graphic illustration that following a divine path may get one into trouble in a corrupted world. That is suffering enough to live with the threat of retribution while taking on humanitarian aims. That is the goal, leaves out as though while taking on humanitarian aims in service to others and to the cause of the divine. But to seek punishment as though that is the goal leaves out the best part, the true contribution of a mission life to begin with. It is not a demonstration of the truth of the divine or the workings of love to be in the throes of physical suffering. That is emulating the consequences of subjugation and torment of the perpetrator, the workings of evil, not divinity.
So I think Creator is definitely going on record here saying that the divine does not value suffering for suffering's sake. And I do want to say, and I have an idea about the stigmatists that I kind of want to share here. I think, in a sense, these are individuals that have attained, they've already attained a pretty high level of holiness, right? So they, through past lives, through past struggles, through past learning, through past endeavors, they have risen up the ladder and become fairly exceptionally holy in their own right, so that they have the deep intuitive reach where they can actually reach out with their mind and connect with Christ's passion and experience his suffering directly. Not everybody can do that. I can't do that, Carl. So there's an attainment that's already been achieved, and we can honor that attainment. But I think what Creator is further saying here is that now, in the situation where they're manifesting stigmata, they are misusing what they've attained. They're misusing their attainment to manifest suffering that's needless and perhaps even sends a contrary message, Carl.
Yeah, that mind over matter is a talent. So it's
Yeah,
kind of an abuse of talent. It's like somebody who is very physical and, tremendously well muscled and powerful and strong. If they set about harming themselves, look out below because they
right.
can do it in a flash without even realizing. And so I think the thing to think about here is that this isn't some weird example of strange people who create stigmata in their body. This is true for everyone because we all have the ability to harm ourselves. And this was mentioned in the course of this answer, that
Yes.
it's the power of consciousness, self directed in a negative way. We all use negative self talk at times and undermine ourselves. And this has huge negative consequences. And this is a big part of our healing work with the Lightworker Healing Protocol, because much of the harm people experience and causes suffering is the reaction to who they've been in the past, what it means, and what they fear it means, and worrying, and ramping up their stress to such a level they get trapped, and
Yeah.
then they suffer. The body breaks down from all of that negativity piling on because they're not countering it in any positive, useful way.
Right.
So this is the dilemma, and it was mentioned that we're all basically living the life of Christ in our own way, maybe only to a small extent or a medium extent, and some to a pretty dramatic parallel, being killed, being tormented and tortured in a way. But there is a path forward, and that's the bottom line. It's
A
coming
thought.
through realization and using the reality of the divine as a touchstone.
Yeah. A thought occurs to me that the idea of the resurrection of Christ was indeed that he overcame excruciating suffering. But if you think about that, the point of suffering isn't to use suffering to overcome suffering. You know, Overcoming suffering is a leap of mind, is a leap of consciousness that basically obliterates suffering. So the goal is to get away from the suffering, and Jesus showed through his experience that he was able to get away from even what many might consider some of the worst human suffering that one could undertake, because there's nothing fun about crucifixion, I can tell you that.
No, I wouldn't wish that on an enemy ever.
No. You ask Creator, once Father Sapachko, who was St. Faustina's spiritual director during her life, once Father Sapachko asked St. Faustina to pray for him. She wrote in her diary, I ask the Lord Jesus to deign to bestow on me all the sufferings and afflictions, both exterior and spiritual, that the priest had to suffer during that day. God partially answered my request, and at once, all sorts of difficulties and adversities sprang up out of nowhere. But that was not all. I began to experience interior sufferings. First, I was seized by depression and aversion towards the sisters. Then a kind of uncertainty began to trouble me. When I tired out, I entered the chapel. A strange pain seized my soul, and I began to weep softly. Then I heard in my soul a voice saying, quote, my daughter, why are you weeping? After all, you yourself offered to undertake these sufferings. Unquote. Father Sapachko wrote in his memoirs, it was only on that critical day, that I asked Sister Faustina for prayer. To my great surprise, all of my troubles vanished into thin air on that very day. So we see an example here, Carl, of St. Faustina asking to take on the sufferings of Father Sapachko and being granted that opportunity and actually being able to take on those sufferings. And in response, Father Sapachko comes back and says, my troubles vanished as soon as I had asked St. Faustina to pray for me. So we have something really quite remarkable going on here. What can Creator tell us about this?
All right, Creator says the taking on of someone else's karma can, in fact, be arranged to happen. This must be done through the divine realm in consultation with a person's higher self, but may well be allowed if there is a high purpose for the arrangement, and in certain circumstances, it can be life saving for one who suffers. But this will always come at a great penalty to the would be healer, wanting to serve in their stead, in effect, to right their wrongs for them and endure the karmic consequences of all that has happened to them, to make their lives so terrible because of the backlog of unmet healing need. So this can be a divine blessing, but also a curse to the would-be helper who may not be fully appreciate who may not fully appreciate all they are getting into. The average person's negative karma is much more than they can handle safely in their own life, in many, many instances, especially for one who is already suffering greatly, to inspire the need for a humanitarian rescue of that sort. That was not quite the case here. More an act of loving kindness through the inspiration and willingness of St. Faustina to take on that extra burden. And this was more a consequence of her faulty thinking and judgment that suffering is an exalted state and a means to become more holy. So she had in it a motive of self interest, in addition to her willingness to help her colleague. We are not wanting to criticize here, only referencing the fact that it was misguided on her part to see the suffering as a benefit to her, other than in the narrow frame of reference that acts of loving kindness will always bring a karmic benefit and will be a tremendous blessing for the recipient of that kindness. So, someone who is coming from strength and willing to make a personal sacrifice to benefit another is engaging in a lofty rescue mission that may well be honored by the divine. The key factor needs to be balancing the level of karmic burden to be that which is most urgently needed, to relieve the suffering of the recipient of the gesture for what ails them in the current life, and not become overambitious and attempt taking on one's burdens in their entirety. So, as in all things, knowledge, discernment, and wisdom are key to make sound choices, wise decisions, and effective contributions to raise up another without great harm to the self and penalize one's own soul in exchange for another. Burdens that can be borne for a time may well be seen as a worthwhile sacrifice to make in the cause of love.
Boy, once again, we get a complex answer. So we've learned that emphatically the divine can allow, in some circumstances, somebody to take on the suffering of somebody else's karma in order to give some relief, and that's an eye opening learning right there. I mean, that's something that I
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, it's eye-opening, and it's also another line of evidence that this whole paradigm that we work with in healing the karmic origins of suffering is valid.
Yeah.
This is a real life example of someone who had their karma removed all in one fell swoop, transferred to someone else who started feeling it,
Yep.
but they were liberated. So
At
this
least,
is a kind of a laboratory clinical, experiencing of divine reckoning, a divine intervention that isn't standard.
right.
But if you
Right.
think about this, it probably does happen many times, because
Sure.
I know people will sometimes pray, let me bear this burden. Help
Right.
my help my suffering child. I'll take on their pain. Give it to
Right.
me. Don't
Oh, yes.
I can't stand seeing them suffer
I'm
this
sure that
way.
happens a lot.
Yeah. And it may well be that some of that pain karmically and its origins in karmic traumas does get transferred to that person because they are asking while in divine alignment.
Right.
So
But
who knows? But
I
this
would
this is an interesting dynamic, and it may be more common than one would think.
I would agree with you, but I would want to probably further point out that Creator also said that what's taken into consideration is the totality of the circumstances, including the belief system of the person making the request, right? Perhaps that, the divine is allowing this to move forward because this is essentially the only realistic way that this particular person making the request is going to be able to be of service. If they're locked down with beliefs that they have to suffer directly in order to relieve somebody else, then the divine is pragmatic, right? And say, well, this is not the optimum way to go about doing this, but this is what's available to us to work with. So we're going to allow this to take place so that there's a win-win as much as possible. But the point, I think, really the bigger lesson here is that there's a higher choice to be made. You don't have to invest personal suffering on behalf of somebody else. It's not totally necessary. There's the light worker healing protocol, where we can ask the divine to simply take care of the karmic difficulties directly without you having to take them on yourself. I think that's the bigger lesson here, Carl.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. It's a very important perspective to have, and it's why we do this. It's not just to enlighten ourselves and share knowledge that is gained in a unique way with others. It's for that end goal of helping awaken people, raise them up, give them hope, and give them knowledge to work with and lead them to the possibility of divine healing on their behalf and that of loved ones.
Yeah, absolutely. You ask Creator, it seems if suffering is currency, it is a factor only in the calculus of karma, that the suffering you cause is the suffering waiting to return to you. So, from a wholly rational perspective, the only quote unquote good accounting of suffering is working to end it as quickly and efficiently as possible through healing and the attainment of wisdom. St. Faustina demonstrated that it was possible to take on the sufferings of others as if one were wearing their cloak for a day. But this seems like an extraordinarily costly, limited, and dangerous to the healer way to do healing. Can Creator share with us how empowered prayer and the Lightworker healing protocol are the most effective ways to end and avoid needless suffering for both subject and healer alike?
All right, Creator tells us your question sets out very nicely a summary of some of the most important teachings and lessons we have addressed in this discussion about the workings of karma and the responsibility to the soul to reckon with one's own choices, including the mistakes. Pursuing ways to suffer is a misguided path that will be, in the end, self limiting as well as highly unpleasant, and we see as unnecessary. There will be plenty of enough chances in life to experience adversity, striving to do one's best and approaching every new experience with optimism and joy in one's heart, to be part of something grand and wonderful in its aim, to see everyone and everything raised up to new heights, in finding ways to reckon with much accumulated misalignment and enormous energies of failure, suffering, hatred, and every other type of negativity ever experienced by beings in the physical. You have your portion with your name on it, as does everyone else. Taking on more, creating more for yourself is not the answer. It is not a path to healing to find new ways to suffer. That is moving backwards rather than forwards. The whole idea of devout believers focusing on making a personal sacrifice leading to personal suffering as a way to attain divine grace on one's behalf is backward thinking. You become divine in divine alignment, in alignment with love and light by loving yourself, all that you are and can be, with further growth and learning and the accumulation of the blessings of positive karma returning to you in kind. The love you put into the world, the joy you bring to others, the kindness you share to help raise them up will raise you in the doing. Suffering will do none of this for anyone, but the opposite instead. So the devout living a monastic existence in isolation, deprivation, and contemplation of a negative focus on suffering as a kind of atonement to bring greater worthiness in the eyes of God is an existence lived in ignorance of the reality of God being already within you and not a distant being you need to work hard to reach and have enough suffering to merit being noticed and appreciated for that level of devotion coming at such a high cost. We can tell you that is not the way to impress us. We will not judge you, but we will not see that as a contribution to your being, nor will the law of karma raise you up through an act of self denial. You will instead be lowered, and that will be added to your self created penalties and all of that karmic burden that acts like a headwind in your life to make everything harder, even and especially seeing the truth of things. The way to deploy your energy is to partner with the divine. That is your birthright, and that is the path to greatness. We will not join you in self torment, self abnegation, and self denial. We will join you in wanting to bring love to bear, to gain greater love in your life, so you have more to give yourself and others. That is working with our energy and on our level, and will bring you into harmony to be in divine alignment and able to live through joy. It is the path to healing, to bring love back to the void created by what has been lost along the way through the suffering from all the karmic traumas you have lived through and died because of many times now. Empowered prayer and the Lightworker Healing Protocol are ideal ways to build a stronger bridge to the divine, to reconnect in a direct way and build that link to be stronger and more effective, to let the love flow and make you a fuller and more complete person in the doing. Prayer will enlist divine help in all ways you need to cope with the physical existence and your personal growth while taking on those challenges. To deal with the mountain of unhealed negative karma you have built up through the ages in multiple prior lives is done best by using the Lightworker Healing Protocol as a premier tool for comprehensive divine healing. Through the LHP, you can bring to bear the greatest of divine firepower to help deal with any problem. Not that it will always be simple and easy to do so quickly. Many problems are so deeply ingrained, they can take a lifetime or more to undo all of the underlying contributing karmic drama. But the LHP excels in doing preventive care for the karmic liabilities looming over you always. Many people have karmic debts that will come due at various times during their life. This is when they develop chronic illnesses, the infirmities of aging, and perhaps premature physical decline or even an early demise through accidental death that might well be a karmic rebalancing. That is a hard way to go about making restitution. If you make the effort to bring in more love to work on the problems you face, the divine can help you rebalance the negativity in your history to free you once and for all and forever from those liabilities. That is a life well lived when it is devoted to not only helping the cause of the divine, but to become more divine oneself.
And that desire to become more divine oneself, we have learned in this episode, is not by undertaking the path of arbitrary suffering. There's plenty of suffering to be had by trying to best oneself, by trying to reach for more and falling short. There's enough suffering as a consequence of that. We don't need to throw gasoline on the fire by pursuing suffering in its own right. And the divine has said that is not going to impress the divine to do that. The best way to become more divine, as we're being invited to do, is through partnership with the divine, and not through any kind of suffering, but instead to be in alignment. And the best way to do that and to carry out that mandate is by learning the Lightworker healing protocol, because healing is really the path forward, Carl.
Well, tell the good folks how they can learn how to use empowered prayer and have access to the LHP and learn at least something about it so they know more what it does.
Indeed. You can get the Empowered Prayer book or the list of empowered prayers at getwisdom.com/prayer. And you can download the Lightworker Healing Protocol ebook that explains the Lightworker Healing Protocol, how it's used, how it can help you if you engage a practitioner, and also how you can learn to do it yourself. All that information is in this ebook. You can download it right now at getwisdom.com/LHP, getwisdom.com/LHP. And I'm afraid that's all we have for this week's Get Wisdom Live, Carl. Thank you very much.
All right. Be well.